Hello, 3RO. Time for another chapter of Surprises according to Humphrey. This is chapter 5, Surprise from Outer Space. I don't know if I had spring fever, but I did have aching muscles following my adventure that afternoon. Besides that, I had a funny feeling in my tummy after I read the note that said dirty rat. I ate a good helping of Nutri-Nibbles, but my stomach still felt weird. Later, Og and I were both in somewhat of a dreamy state when the door opened, the lights came on, and I heard a familiar squeaking. Aldo, I said, and I rushed to the front of my cage to greet my friend. I was hoping he'd be a little easier to understand than he'd been the night before. Boing! Boing? Og sounded alarmed, but I couldn't really see why. Then I looked. There was Aldo's cart, piled high with his broom, his mop and pail, lots of spray bottles and cloths and trash bags to be filled. And there was someone pushing the cart, just as Aldo did every night during the week. But that person was not Aldo. Eek! I squeaked. The person with the cart was much shorter. The person had no mustache, had longer hair, pulled back in a ponytail. The person had on a red sweatshirt and gray sweatpants and black sneakers. That person was definitely a girl, or a woman. Well, a female anyway. And there was something strange about the way she moved. She tugged at her ear, snapped her fingers, and swung her arms in an odd rhythm. Still, she straightened the desks, swept the floor, then mopped it, which Aldo didn't do every night. Then she dusted the shelf where Og and I live, but she didn't even seem to notice us. How do you do? I squeaked up as politely as possible. Could you please tell me, what did you do with Aldo? Og seemed quite upset as he began hopping up and down, repeating one boing after another. That person who was cleaning didn't even seem to notice. As she swept closer to my cage, I saw there was a device attached to her ear. Og, I said nervously. I saw a movie at Seth's house about an alien from another planet, and that alien acted very strange, kind of like this person. Og stopped hopping and started listening. You don't think she could be one of them, do you? I asked. Because in that movie, the space aliens captured a human and took him to their planet. I mean, you don't think that happened to Aldo, do you? Og stayed very quiet. In the movie, the space aliens had wires in his head too. I was sorry I'd seen that movie because it made me think very scary thoughts. See that thing in her ear? She could be getting signals from the mothership. I tried not to become hysterical. That's what they called it in the movie, the mothership. Finally, the person who had done a very nice job cleaning for a creature from outer space wheeled the cart out the door. She turned off the lights, without opening the blinds like Aldo always did, and left room 26. The room was quiet except for the tick-tock of the clock, which seemed to be much louder than usual. Suddenly, the lights came back on. The person walked in. She came over to my cage and reached in her pocket. A ray gun, Og! Watch out! The space aliens in the movie had ray guns so they could capture the Earthlings, I squeaked. She pulled out a small carrot and shoved it between the bars of my cage. Then she left again, turning out the lights so we were plunged back into darkness. Eek! I squeaked. When my eyes adjusted to the dark, I stared at the little carrot. I mean, I guess that's not really a ray gun, I said, but it could be an alien carrot. Boing, Og agreed. It was nice of the creature to give me a carrot, but I have to admit, I didn't touch it. Not all night long. You can't be too sure about aliens, you know. They can be very tricky. And I still had no idea what had happened to my good friend Aldo. The world looked normal again in the light of day, and the morning went on like any other morning in room 26, except for the fact that Garth and AJ were both very quiet. In fact, they never even looked at each other. Then came time for recess. While Mrs. Brisbane wrote word problems on the board, I spun on my wheel knowing my friends were exercising on the playground. Suddenly, the door swung open and in walked Mrs. Wright, pulling Garth along with her. He looked very unhappy. Mrs. Brisbane, you'll have to do something about this boy, the PE teacher announced. Mrs. Brisbane was surprised. Garth, what happened? You know our students are required to get a certain amount of physical activity at recess every day, said Mrs. Wright. But I found this young man hiding behind the building when he was supposed to be playing with a ball. Strictly against the rules. Were you hiding, Garth? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Kind of, he mumbled. Mrs. Brisbane told Mrs. Wright that she'd take care of the situation. What will you do? the PE teacher asked, playing with the whistle. That's between Garth and I. There was ice in Mrs. Brisbane's voice. Thank you, Mrs. Wright. You can leave now. Mrs. Wright left, thank goodness, and Mrs. Brisbane told Garth to sit down. Why weren't you playing with your friends? She asked. I don't have any. Of course you do, Garth, Mrs. Brisbane insisted. You have lots of friends. Not anymore. Mrs. Brisbane spoke very softly. Please tell me what happened. I'm lousy at softball, and when they choose teams, I always get picked last. Garth's voice quivered. Yesterday, AJ was the team captain and got to pick his players, and even he picked me last. I'm his best friend. I mean, I was his best friend. He even picked Saya before me, and she's not very good either. Then Tabitha told Seth they lost because of me, so I just decided I'm not playing anymore. He sniffled, and Mrs. Brisbane handed him a tissue. I'm sure that hurt a lot. It always hurt me when I got picked last. I wasn't very good at sports, Mrs. Brisbane said. But you're a girl, Garth told her. Girls don't have to be good. Mrs. Brisbane smiled a little. I understand that Tabitha is the best player in class and she's a girl. Yeah, but still, it's different being a boy, Garth sighed. AJ would probably pick Humphrey instead of me. Well, yes, he might. I am quite popular with my friends. But I don't know how to play softball, I have to admit. I'm good at hamster ball, though. Garth and Mrs. Brisbane sat in silence for a while. I think AJ was mean not to pick Garth, I blurted out. It sounds like Humphrey has something to say on the subject, said the teacher. Garth didn't even smile. Tell you what, she continued. You and AJ bring your lunches in here today, and we'll talk. He'll think I told on him, Garth protested. Don't worry, I'll make sure he doesn't, Mrs. Brisbane said. But I can't make him choose you first. Even if he picked me third or fourth, it would have been okay. Just not last, said Garth. Mrs. Brisbane glanced at the clock and said that recess was almost over. She asked him to feed Og some of his yucky crickets, something Garth really likes to do. I headed for my sleeping hut to think about what I'd just heard. I didn't know a thing about softball. I'd never been chosen for a team either, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't want to be picked last, especially by my best friend. Lunchtime rolled around and Mrs. Brisbane told Garth and AJ to bring their lunches to the classroom. This was a surprising thing that had never happened before, being in a hamster ball or having Aldo captured by aliens. AJ brought his lunch from home in a bright blue bag. Garth carried his on a tray and it smelled yummy. Mrs. Brisbane took a container of yogurt and a spoon out of her bag. But no one, not even Mrs. Brisbane, ate a bite. AJ, Mrs. Wright said that you picked a very good softball team yesterday, she began. Yeah, said AJ loudly. But she was surprised that you didn't pick Garth until last. AJ stared down at his untouched sandwich. I was kind of surprised to hear that too, the teacher continued, since you're such good friends and all. Yes, ma'am, said AJ. It's just, well, Garth's not the best player, and I think when you're choosing a team, you've got to pick the best players, right? I mean, I suppose so, said Mrs. Brisbane, but how do you feel about that, Garth? Garth squirmed in his chair. It wouldn't have hurt for him to pick me. I ended up on the team anyway. So it made you feel bad to be picked last, Mrs. Brisbane said. Garth said, looking miserable. So did AJ. Somebody's got to be picked last, said AJ. The rest of the team would have been mad if I picked you before somebody like Richie or Kirk. I never thought of that, said Mrs. Brisbane, stirring the yogurt with her spoon. Well, now I'm mad because it feels really awful to be picked last, said Garth. His cheeks were flaming red. I guess it does, Mrs. Brisbane agreed. As far as I could see, the conversation was going nowhere. Back and forth, with no end in sight. Mrs. Brisbane agreed with both of them, but neither boy changed his mind. I imagine AJ is sorry that you felt bad, said Mrs. Brisbane. Right? Well, yeah, AJ said. I'll bet Garth realizes what a hard decision it was for you, AJ, she added. Right, Garth? Yeah. Garth sounded like he had more to say, but Mrs. Brisbane didn't let him. Good. Then the two of you can play ball together and be friends as well. After all, softball is only a game. It shouldn't be important enough to break up a friendship. Agreed? The boys nodded. They really didn't have much of a choice. Mrs. Brisbane wasn't quite finished. Then, at the next recess, you'll play ball, won't you, Garth? Garth groaned. I'll just strike out and everybody will be mad at me. You don't keep your eye on the ball, AJ blurted out. I do too, Garth snapped back. I keep my eye on the ball as it sails right past my back. Mrs. Brisbane glanced at the clock. Eat your lunches now. You've got to keep your strength up for the next game. She sounded very cheery, but Garth and AJ looked about as uncheery as two people could be. They ate their lunches in silence until I couldn't stand it anymore. For goodness sakes, make up already, I squeaked. Mrs. Brisbane craned her neck to look at me. I didn't know you were so interested in sports, Humphrey, she said, and the boys finally smiled a little. I don't know much about sports, but I know about Garth and AJ, and if Mrs. Brisbane couldn't get them to be friends again, I would have to take control of this situation. It's just that I didn't have a single idea of how I would do it. Humphrey's Dictionary of Wonderful Words. Alien, somebody or something from another land or even another planet. Aliens can be any size, shape, or color, and they usually want to take you to their leader. All right, that's it for chapter 5 today. Be ready for chapter 6. Have a great day, everybody. See ya.